whatever, is their margin. That's where they make their money. If they can loan money out at 8% and borrow it at 4%, they get the delta, right? That's their business. And moreover, there's some risk associated with that delta, right? Look at all the mortgage foreclosures here in the United States over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. The banks that loaned against those mortgages, when the homeowners that borrowed that money defaulted, then the banks didn't have the money flowing in from the borrowers to pay back the people that deposited their scarce money in bank deposits, for example. All right. So there are a host of interest rates. Up till now, we've talked about interest rates, and the simplest way to think about the interest rates that we've discussed up until now is the opportunity cost of the decision maker who's trying to make a choice. And if it turns out the decision maker is the public sector or the government, then it's what is the opportunity cost for government as well. But here, I want to note that there's a whole bunch of interest rates out there, and these interest rates come back to the point that Omega made about whatever trust she has with regard to her sister. Whenever there is a party who's responsible for making the interest payments, but there's some default risk, everything else constant, the interest rate should be much higher, right? The interest rate should reflect the probability of default. If you go and look at a bank loaning money to, say, a major multinational company, make it Apple, a bank loaning money to Apple. Not that Apple needs to borrow any money because they're sitting on more than $100 billion worth of cash, but banks would fall all over themselves to loan them money at 2 or 3%. Right? If a startup company walks in to borrow money from the bank, what interest rate is that bank going to charge the startup company? Pardon? A lot higher, a lot higher. In fact, much of that money goes at 14%. Why is it 14%? Because there's a risk of default. You look at it and say, well, that's unfair. You're not helping the companies grow and give them the necessary capital, so they're in a good position to increase the amount of employment, serve the basis for economic growth going forward. But that doesn't take into account the risk of default and the company not being able to make their payments and the bank making the loan never getting back their principal. Right? So there's a whole bunch of interest rates out there. I think the simplest way for you to think about it, those interest rates that are very low risk, that's to say low risk of default, and one of the lowest risk of defaults is, at least in this country, is treasury bonds or treasury bills. And the argument is there is no risk because the government, the federal government, stands behind the payments against that particular amount that's being borrowed. Now, ask yourself, gee whiz, what did Greece citizens think when they were buying Greece sovereign debt? They thought that the government stood behind it as well, and there was no risk. And initially, if you go back 15 years ago or 10 years ago, the interest rate that the Greek government was paying was a very low level. What happened 3 months ago, a month ago? That interest rate got as high as, the last time I looked, it was 38%. Right? Why was it 38%? Because the people lending the government money weren't sure they were ever going to be paid back. So they wanted a huge rate of return on their scarce resources because they were concerned about whether the Greeks will be able to honor the commitments that they made with regard to future payments. Other risks that's out there, there's some general discussion here about the S&P. Coming back to the simple example of the homeowner investing in energy efficiency, they could take that same money and invest it in the S&P. Right? And with regard to the S&P, what is your expected return? Because that is certainly highly uncertain with regard to what's going to be generated over the course of the next year. Okay, Gabe, you had a question?
Yeah, I was talking to my friend about the Dow Jones, and we had an interesting idea. Craft on the Dow Jones. Right?
See what?
The Dow Jones is supposed to represent how the U.S. economy is doing at any time, right?
No, that's not true. It's only representing how 30 companies are doing.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So it's not a great representation of our economy.
No, it's not. Because first of all, Apple is not included among those 30, and it's been the most successful corporation, certainly over the last decade, if not over the entire history of the U.S. economy. But it's not included as part of the 30. Apple is included as part of the S&P, because the S&P is 500 different stocks. So it may turn out in most, I don't want to go too far down this road, but there's a huge difference between stocks that are value stocks versus growth stocks. Most of the stocks that are in the S&P, in the Dow Jones are value stocks. They don't have included as a major segment the stocks that are expected to grow at a very rapid rate. So it's hardly representative. Right. History, legacy. That's why. Most sophisticated investors don't focus on it. They focus on the S&P, or even better yet, the Russell 2000, which is noted here. All right. Okay. Right away, given this discussion, if I'm looking at the future and I want to get the flows over the future, the one thing that's crystal clear is the future is uncertain. So I've got to have some way of taking into account that uncertainty. Now, this is beyond this course, but all the discussion about benefit-cost analysis, ultimately you want to take the benefits, if they're over a 20-year horizon or whatever, and risk adjust them. Okay, that's beyond. That kind of concept and complexity is beyond this course. But I just want you to keep in mind that with regard to any benefits and costs that occur over some future period are, in fact, uncertain, and there's some risk associated with the payment flows, the outflows or the inflows with regard to benefits. But one thing you all should keep in mind, your greatest risk is not investments that you might make with regard to monetary values or assets, putting them in savings accounts, putting in different bond instruments, depending on their risk profile, whether it's a corporate bond or a treasury bond. Your greatest risk is your human capital. And that risk, you don't know how healthy you're going to be 50 years from now or 30 years from now. And it's in your best interest to hedge against potential unfortunate events. And that is the greatest risk with regard to computing correctly what the present value is of your asset, namely yourself. Right? It's referred to by economists as human capital. And the bottom line here is you should go to the gym more, you should study more, because the real opportunity with regard to creating value and the risk associated with that value is your own human capital. Say what? Okay, you're quite right. The business section of the New York Times. It's about halfway between the two, right? You're quite right. Okay, how to hedge against the risk. Now, investors hold the S&P, which we've already noted is a much broader asset class than what is represented in the Dow Jones. It includes direct competitors. Intel and AMD are direct competitors, and if I hold the S&P, it's far less risky than holding a position in just Intel, for example. And there's a rich literature with regard to financial economics about idiosyncratic risk, market risk, that too is beyond this course. But in terms of looking at the opportunity cost of your scarce resources or available funds, these are the kind of issues that naturally arise with respect to the risk that is taken and how to effectively manage that risk over some future horizon. What we really care about in this course is what interest rate should be used for public projects, for investment in natural resources, for investment in public goods. And let's make it concrete. I want to build a dam. Now, there are all sorts of benefits from building that dam. One, I can generate renewable electricity because it's going to be based on the energy forces with regard to water itself, right? I'm not going to be using any direct fossil fuels for this. It can be used for more efficient irrigation, flood control. And if the interest rate is very high, it's going to reduce the present value of benefits associated with the decision of whether or not to invest in this dam. If the discount rate or the interest rate is much lower, then that's going to increase the present value of benefits. But how do we go about selecting the right interest rate or the right discount rate? Now, since we're talking about society, we're talking about the social discount rate. What is the correct social discount rate that should be used? And that is the heading on this particular slide. And there are lots of different views out here. I expressed two of these particular views, and they're discussed in the reading for today. One is that people believe that the government should do things that the private sector cannot do. And in particular, you couldn't find a company or an individual that would be prepared to invest in a dam, but their view is that the government should make that determination. And moreover, in the government's determination of whether to make that investment, they should use a social discount rate, and most of the people that argue this position have the view that the social discount rate should be lower than the private interest rate or the market interest rate. Another perspective is global warming, for example, is an externality. If you did a survey of most rational members of our population, not all members, you'd have to do a stratified sample, right? But in that stratified sample, you would say, gee whiz, that's an externality. The government ought to come along and tax that externality. And that is the right solution, instead of worrying about whether the social discount rate is higher or lower than some private market rate. Now, there is a famous debate that goes directly to this very question about the social discount rate. And let me see if I can motivate this a bit. When I was senior economist in the Council of Economic Advisors, the first observation of a hole in the ozone layer took place in 1987. Right? And the question that came before the Council by the President and the Chief of Staff, who happened to be a former senator from Tennessee at the time, remember him you're all too young to know about the Nixon hearings, right? He was the fellow who made a comment, we have to know who knew what and when. It's that simple. Howard was his first name, what was his last name? It escapes me at the moment. But in any event, the point was, if you look at what the public sector should be doing with regard to this discovery that took place, and if you did any analysis about what the impact would be currently, there was no monetary impact currently. You couldn't put any real value on it. If you went out 2 generations, then yes, you could put a value on it. But if you had a positive discount rate, like that graph I showed you with regard to different interest rates with respect to future values versus present values, if you put a positive interest rate in it, it gave you the same answer, do nothing. Right? So there's been an active debate among economists about what is the right social discount rate. Because if you have a social discount rate that is fairly high, then the public sector won't do anything today. And if you wait, given the uncertainty associated with global warming, it may turn out that whenever you decide to do something, it's too late. Right? Because the science hasn't progressed to the point at which you can measure the stages of the actual degradation that's possible going forward. These two economists, one is Nicholas Stern, who did an analysis and said, gee whiz, the social discount rate with regard to global warming should be 0. Right? And the argument is, I don't want to be in a position where I underweight future generations, because that's basically what you're doing. If you have a positive discount rate or a positive interest rate, what you're doing is discounting the value that would reside with future generations. So his argument is that the right moral value for the social discount rate is near 0. And then an economist, a famous economist from Yale, came along and said, no, Stern, you're wrong. Because the opportunity cost associated with resources that are used today for abatement could be used for other purposes, and instead we should be using a market interest rate for making this decision. And Nordhaus's conclusion is, go slow, phase in over time, recognizing the current opportunity cost of scarce resources, go slow in implementing avoidance measures. That is an active debate that's still going on, and it shouldn't surprise you that the profession as a whole hasn't reached the conclusion. It's actually polarized. There are a number of people who believe Stern's got it right, and there are other people who believe that Nordhaus has it right. But the bottom line is, it turns on one measure and one measure alone. What is the appropriate social discount rate? Okay?
Is it not kind of an ideal for real situation? Because having a social discount rate 0 is kind of an ideal point of view, right? It's not kind of romantic to say that it can all be done now, whereas Nordhaus is more like do it over time, take this
and recognizing what the opportunity cost of those scarce resources are. But it's still, at the end of the day, it turns on that social discount rate, and that, in turn, is influenced directly about how much you value future generations, right? Okay, so benefit cost analysis. I only have a few moments, but very quickly. As I've indicated, there are 3 different methodologies that are out there. Let me just talk it rather than go through the slides, and I'll pick that up in the next lecture. Once we've gone through the measurement of all the future flows of benefits, and we've taken into account all the future flows of cost, and we come to a decision about what the right discount rate is, or the right interest rate, we have every bit of factual information we need to make a choice. But what's the criteria for making the choice? As your textbook outlines, there are 3 different criteria. One is what we've already discussed, namely the net present value. Take the present value of all the benefits, less the present value of all the cost, and choose the one that gives you the maximum net benefit, right? Okay, that's one criteria. A second criteria that's frequently used by the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Energy, EPA, is called the benefit cost ratio. And by the way, if the benefit cost ratio, if you talk to some of these analysts, you say, their eyes will light up and say, the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. That's nothing more than saying the net present value is greater than 0, right? It's no more complicated than that. Okay, so suppose, however, in each of those 2 criteria, you have to know what the social discount rate is, because that's embedded in the computation, because you're putting everything in present value terms. Suppose you don't know what the social discount rate is. Now you turn to a third methodology. And the third methodology is that you compute the internal rate of return. What is that? The internal rate of return is that interest rate or discount rate that equates the present value of all benefits to the present value of all costs. Right? Instead of specifying it and entering it into the first two computations, the first two being net present value of benefits less cost, or the benefit cost ratio, you say, I don't know what the social discount rate is, but I have the flows on all future benefits and all future costs, and I'm just going to equate the two and compute what is the interest rate that would make the two equal. Now, when I do that, is that internal rate of return, that's what it's called by the financial economists or business finance people. Now, if that internal rate of return is very high, that says something about what we should be doing with regard to the choices that we're faced with. That's it. Thank you.